Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the game management update. We are here to go through how we formulate our recommendations for the fall hunts, deer, bighorn sheep, javelina, and other species, small game migratory birds. My name is Amber Munig, and I am the Big Game Program Supervisor for the state of Arizona. We also have Larissa Harding here. She's the Small Game Program Supervisor, and towards the end of the presentation, we will switch, and she will be presenting the small game information. So who's involved in setting hunt recommendations? It starts with our wildlife managers, and it goes up through regional staff, through the regional game specialists and the program managers, and finally through the statewide biologists. Eventually, it comes to the program managers, that's myself and Larissa. We share those recommendations with agency leadership, and ultimately it's presented to the commission for final approval. Throughout that process, we do attempt to engage you, our constituents and the public, in drafting these recommendations. The bulk of your input comes to play when we're setting our hunt guidelines, which are done every 5 years. As we go through this presentation, our comments are going to be collected using an email. The email is azhuntguidelines@azgfd.gov, and this email address will be provided at the end of the presentation also. So how do we work through this entire process? It's got multiple tiers and multiple steps as we go through it. This is for setting the seasons, selecting season dates, permit allocations, and bag limits. It starts with our 5-year guidelines, which set those parameters under which we manage. We use our population surveys, our hunter harvest surveys, and our social input, the input that you provide to help guide what those guidelines will be. Those inputs also influence the recommendations. This year, normally we do a 2-year hunt recommendation, but this year is going to be just for the spring of 22 seasons. And those recommendations end up in the regulations, which are the season dates and the permit levels that you apply for. We conduct population surveys every 2 years, and for most species, and that's a unit every other year gets surveyed. The department responsibly manages Arizona's wildlife within the biological limits of each species, and our management strategies are developed to meet the social acceptability, which is routinely much more conservative than the biological limits under which a species can be managed. Public involvement is very critical. It's part of the North American model of wildlife conservation. Our wildlife is held in public trust and belongs to all citizens, resident and non-resident. And this is unlike other countries where its access is restricted to people by either financial or social class. Our laws regulate hunting, and that too is governed by a public process. Both of these are core principles to the North American model of wildlife conservation. Our harvest data is collected using our hunter harvest questionnaire. This is a mail-out questionnaire that we send out every year to all hunters who draw a permit and to all hunters who purchase an over-the-counter tag. For species like the small game species where there's no tag required, but you're required to have a hunting license, we do a random sample of hunters and attempt to survey that. We have implemented a process to, let me back up. We've got our migratory bird program where it's got a harvest information stamp and it's a registration. You have to complete this survey when you buy your license or your stamp. If you buy it from a third-party vendor, please make sure that you are completing all the questionnaires and not allowing them to just skip through them and input zeros. That data is very important for managing the migratory birds at the federal level. Arizona is a key state for data collection for these HIP stamps, particularly for the dove harvest. Our small game and predator furbearer hunter questions it's a questionnaire that's sent out to a random sample of hunters. We have added questions when you buy a license that ask whether you regularly participate in small game species hunting or predator furbearer species hunting. It is important that you check those boxes accurately so that we can get those questionnaires to you, the folks that are actually hunting those animals. For big game, we've got our permitted hunts and our non-permitted hunts, the over-the-counter hunts. Questionnaires are sent out to those also. You're pretty familiar with those. That's been a standard practice for many years. These questionnaires are both mailed and emailed to hunters. Any hunter that provides an email address during the online application process, we're able to send you an email with that questionnaire and send reminder questionnaires in case you have forgotten to submit it after your hunt. Our population survey and our harvest data can be found on our website at azgfd.com. You select hunting and then select the type in survey data, and you'll get to a page where there's many different attachments that have the harvest data and the survey data for prior years. This is where you can also find the draw odds within those data sets. So these following slides are demonstrate some of the drought conditions that we have been in this year, and well, more than this year. For the 2020 drought levels, you can see that much of Arizona has been in an extreme drought, and even areas that have been in a very exceptional drought. This slide is a temperature slide, and it goes back to 1895. It's from 1895 to 2019, and it shows the change in temperature based on an average generated from 1901 to 2000. When you're looking at this, the last 20 years are very severe. They're very dry. But when you consider those, well, when you look at this, and though it's not good, when you consider it based on the short amount of time frame, the 20 years that we're talking about, we're not looking at a significant change in the past 20 years. So we've been managing under drought conditions, under severe temperatures for well over 20 years. Wildlife abundance in Arizona is tied closely to rainfall. Periodic droughts, they reduce the overall nutrition for wildlife and result in loss of fat reserves and declines in general health. This decline in body condition reduces adult survival, and it affects the reproduction with the upcoming years, resulting in population declines. Our hunt guidelines are an adaptive managed approach that allow us to appropriately monitor populations and adjust harvest levels associated with those changing populations. We expect that the current drought conditions will result in fewer animals, lower recruitment, and possibly short-term declines in populations. We will continue to monitor these populations and adjust permits as appropriate. So moving into mule deer, for our standard management units, this is most of the units within the state, we manage for fawn to doe ratios of 40 to 50 fawns per 100 does, 20 to 30 bucks per 100 does, and a hunt success range that's between 15 and 25%. These ranges were established through the hunt guidelines and through the public process that the hunt guidelines goes through. And of course, for deer, we're always actually managing for increasing populations where possible, and that is why for most units, we do not harvest does in Arizona. We want to see these populations continue to grow. There's room for growth in nearly every population of mule deer in the state. For our alternative management units, these are units 12A, 12B, 13A, 13B, 3A, 3C, and 17A, 45A, 45B, and 45C. Each of these we manage for a higher buck to doe ratio, we manage for higher hunt success, and we start to manage for a percentage of older age class bucks in the population. The last parameter that we're looking at is a lower hunter density in the field during those hunts, and that means fewer permits. Statewide mule deer surveys. So on this slide, this is our statewide mule deer survey slide. The dotted line at the top, we manage for 40 to 50 fawns per 100 does, and then the blue dotted lines are our buck to doe guidelines. And so we're managing for 20 to 30 bucks per 100 does. As you can see, our buck per doe ratio has been within guidelines, and it's fairly stable in the center of guidelines. This is at a statewide level. When you look at it unit by unit, some units are above guidelines, some units are below guidelines, and permits are adjusted based on those units that are below guidelines or trending down towards the bottom of guidelines. So for whitetail deer, our standard parameters, again, are 30 to 40 fawns per 100 does, 20 to 30 bucks per 100 does, and 15 to 25% hunt success. The units that we manage alternatively for older age class deer are units 6A, 23, 30B, 31, and 36C. Again, these have a higher fawn to doe and buck to doe ratio that we manage for and higher hunt success. Whitetail differs a little bit than mule deer in the alternative management structure. For whitetail deer hunts, permits are allocated to result in up to 30% of the unit's harvest coming from those December hunts. That's the last 3 weeks of December is when those hunts occur. The population survey for whitetail deer, we did see the fawn to doe ratios drop below guidelines this year. The buck to doe ratio is still within guidelines, but it's trending down at the moment. Again, these ratios and the trend of these ratios are what guided our permit reductions and the reductions to over-the-counter archery deer this year. When we look at harvest, statewide for general deer, the green line is hunters, the yellow line is hunt success. We have been decreasing permits slightly over the last few years, and you can see that it's reflected in the slight drop in the number of hunters in the field. Hunt success at the same time has been climbing with a little bit of a dip in 2019, but it's still well above where it was 15 and 20 years ago. This will be a parameter that we look at closely when we enter into our hunt guidelines evaluation, which is starting in January of 2022. So into archery deer. There's been a lot of discussion about why the department is recommending or proposing so many reductions for archery deer. When we look at, I'm going to back up, our hunt guidelines state that up to 20% of the total harvest for deer may be allocated for archery take. When we look at the take through the firearms or the draw seasons, plus what's occurring through our archery over-the-counter seasons, and you calculate what percentage archery deer take is, a significant number of the units, especially for mule deer, exceeded 20% take. With that guideline alone, it tells us to start reducing the amount of opportunity that's available for that particular unit. We have the option of removing opportunity in any one of these fashions, either eliminating December timeframe, January, or part of January, eliminating the August-September timeframe. Eventually, if there's only a single opportunity available and that hunt is still well above the 20% guideline, then that unit would be considered for moving into a permitted draw. When we looked at the 2019 and the 2020 archery over-the-counter harvest data, many units were above that 20% guideline. Another factor that we considered during this process was looking at the effects of the drought in association with where the individual populations in a unit sat, and also looking at what the conditions were on the landscape for those animals. Was there a significant wildfire in an area, and did that impact how a population could respond or recover from that fire? Many of the fires that we've seen in the last 2 years have had very poor short-term response where you get some good growth right after those fires. Typically, a fire ends up being a really good thing for wildlife populations. This is something we've seen In Unit 1, after the Wallow Fire, we saw our elk populations and our deer populations both respond really well after that fire. We saw it after the Rodeo Chetasky Fire in Unit 3A, 3C. The difference today is that we didn't get enough precipitation after the Bighorn Fire or after the fires in Units 22 and 24B to see those habitats have a short-term positive recovery, enough growth so those populations could respond well after the fire. Another comment that we're seeing pretty frequently right now is how the tags are distributed between residents and non-residents. The top chart on this slide shows over-the-counter tag sales. Back in 2007, we were sitting at about 23,000 tags sold annually to archery deer hunters. Today, 2020, we're sitting at 30,000 tags sold to archery deer hunters. The yellow line is our resident line, and the blue line shows our non-resident line. And so, yes, we have seen a slight increase in the number of non-residents that are participating in our over-the-counter archery deer seasons, but they're still sitting at only 10.5% of the total hunters participating in archery deer in Arizona. The bottom slide here shows over-the-counter archery deer harvest. The orange line is total harvest, and you're looking at the parameters on the left side of the slide. The blue line is hunt success, and you're looking at the percentages on the right-hand side of that slide. In 2007, harvest was about 1,600 animals that year. In 2020, we're looking at 3,400 animals, deer taken in a single year. And so the total number of animals and hunt success have significantly increased over the past 15 years for archery deer harvest. These also are the parameters that are affecting why you're seeing those reductions to archery deer opportunity. There's also been some questions about how we gather this data. This is through our hunter questionnaire process. Our firearm hunters, those permitted draw hunts, we get really good response rates from those hunters. We're looking at 40 to 50% response rate for those permit holders. And although it's not 100%, that data is statistically strong enough to predict what harvest is in a given unit. For archery deer hunters, this year we're sitting at 22% response rate. We need to have those response rates increased so that that data is stronger and our recommendations are even more accurate and responsive to what's going on the landscape. There's been some interest in us moving towards mandatory harvest reporting. This is something that we've heard for many years, and yes, it would give us more data, but it doesn't always give us better data. But what it does do is it puts a regulatory burden on you, the hunter, in order to make sure that you respond. And if you don't, then there's a penalty associated with it. It could be that you can't buy a tag in the future, in that year, or within a couple of years. It could be a monetary penalty. It is a penalty, and so it puts a burden on hunters and can influence hunter retention in our activity here. And hunter retention is crucial to both the Arizona Game and Fish Department and to you and the Arizona Game and Fish Commission. So our proposed recommendations for deer, we're looking at overall a 2,690 permit reduction for our permitted hunts. This reduction, the bulk of it is showing up in the general seasons with minor reductions in youth. The youth hunt reductions are mostly the hunt on the North Kaibab, the antlerless deer hunt in units 12A West. The 12A West population did have lower fawn recruitment this year, and so this recommendation is solely to allow that population to grow at a rate and maintain those age classes we want in our other deer hunt harvest levels. There's a minor reduction for muzzleloader, and you'll see that there's some increase in permits for permitted archery hunts. We are recommending that 2 units shift from the over-the-counter structure into this permitted structure, and that permit increase is specific to those units that are rotating into the permitted draw structure. Those units are 2A, 2B, and 2C, and then unit 27. For archery over-the-counter, the recommendations are posted on our website, and there are numerous reductions throughout many of the hunts. It could be the removal of a December time frame, a January time frame, shifting from an any antlered deer hunt to an antlered white-tailed deer hunt. Please look at that closely and be aware of what those recommendations are. For pronghorn, elk, and turkey, I'm not really going to get into any data on these tonight. We will be presenting recommendations for these 3 species in October, and so look for a public outreach effort at that particular time. However, any comments that you do have regarding elk, pronghorn, or turkey, we'd be happy for you to submit those emails to us, and we will provide responses. For javelina, we are making recommendations for both the fall javelina hunt and the spring javelina hunt. The guidelines that, the parameters that guide us through permit allocations for javelina are the average herd size. We manage between 7 and 11 animals per herd. And as you can see, statewide, of course there's variation unit by unit, the average herd size has been staying within guidelines. We also look at Javelina recruitment. And although it fluctuates quite a bit, it's been fluctuating within guidelines. We manage for 20 to 30 young per 100 adults. We did see a drop in this winter's surveys, and it dropped just below guidelines. It's something we will be watching closely over the next couple years to see if this is a trend that's happening or this was just a single blip in this slide. For javelina permits, permits authorized is the blue line here, and they've been pretty stable across time. We don't tend to fluctuate much. Occasionally you'll see in a single unit increase or decrease, but overall we're not doing, we haven't experienced a lot of major changes. The orange line is the first choice applicants. And for many years we had a lot of leftover permits for javelina. In the past 5 years, we've started to see those first choice applicants increase, and there's fewer permits going into the leftover first come, first serve pool, and the demand is almost equal to the permits that we currently authorize. Our javelina recommendation, we will be evaluating the 2 javelina bag limit as we go through the hunt guidelines review starting in January. We will be looking at that really closely to determine if it's still appropriate. For fall javelina hunts, the actual draw hunts, we're not recommending any changes, but we are recommending that units 35A and 35B have companion javelina tags that will be associated with the youth deer hunts in those units. For spring javelina, we're looking at some permit decreases both for general, ham, and archery. Many of these decreases are in unit 16A, and then there's a few other units that have some smaller decreases. Another significant change for the spring javelina is, and actually this will be for fall too, some of the region 4 units, portions of 39, 40A, 40B, and 41 will be shifting into a general year-long over-the-counter season. That season will start July 1, 2021 through December 31, 2021, and then it'll be for the entire calendar year for 2022. For bighorn sheep, we manage for permits to be 15 to 25% of the Class 3 and Class 4 rams. A Class 3 ram is a 6 to 8 year old, and a Class 4 ram is a 9+ year old. Average score of rams that have been harvested recently have been around the 6 to 7 year old to 6 to 8 year old range, And then for average score, it's been running between 160 and 165 for the past several years. For bison, we have 2 bison populations that we manage in the state. We have our Raymond Wildlife Herd, and then we have our House Rock Wildlife Area herd. We've actually got 2 herds on the House Rock Wildlife Area. One is the original herd, which resides mostly up on the forest and moves in and out of the Grand Canyon National Park. And then we have a small, newer subpopulation down on House Rock Wildlife Area itself. These populations are managed to provide as much recreational opportunity as possible without adversely affecting the habitat and without adversely affecting those bison populations and causing them to start to roam further from the areas where we want them to be located. For black bear, we manage for stratified fall and spring bear seasons. The legal animal is any bear except sows with cubs or cubs with sows. Every unit has a female harvest limit, or every hunt has a female harvest limit associated with it, and each unit has an annual female harvest limit associated with it. And that harvest limit is a calendar year limit. It is cumulative for each hunt that occurs throughout the year, and it targets 10% or less of the female segment of the population. We do have, it's not completely new, it's been deployed for a year now, but we've got a tool for bear and lion on our website that allows you to report your bear harvest and then schedule your physical check-in of that bear. When you're on our website, you're going to go to azgfd.com, go to hunting, go to species, and select black bear hunting, or black bear. We also have on our website an ability to check where that particular unit is sitting with the female harvest limit and whether or not it looks like that unit's approaching closure or if it's actually already closed. This was something that you can still call in and get the same information on our toll-free number, but this information is online now and much easier to access, especially when you're in the field. For mountain lions, we're managing for sustainable mountain lion populations across the state. We've broken the state up into 15 management zones and established harvest thresholds within each of those zones. The percent female harvest will be evaluated after each hunting season, and a 3-year average of greater than 25% female take could result in a change to a management zone, whether it's a shortened season or a reduction in the threshold. When a harvest threshold is reached, that management zone will close for the remainder of the season. And we have seen this occur multiple times this year alone, and so those units are actually closed until May 31st. They will reopen with archery deer in August. We are recommending continuing the mandatory checkout process, and depredation take and department removals do not count towards the mountain lion harvest thresholds for any given zone. Under ARS 17302, take of bear mountain lion for protection of property remains in effect year-long regardless of any of the season closures. This slide just shows our mountain lion harvest over time. We really are pretty steady. It does have a few years where it blips up and down, but pretty much we tend to harvest between 250 and 350 mountain lions annually. The female harvest is pretty steady across that scale also. The orange line on this graph shows female harvest. For the mountain lion thresholds, the season proposed to open will be August 20 through May 31st of 22. The only change that we're recommending is to Zone N. This is the zone that includes units 46A and 46B, which will be opening to mountain lion take this year. And so that threshold is increasing by 2. This map just shows the mountain lion management zones. Since establishing zones, we have not adjusted any of these. During the hunt guideline process, we will be looking at these zones. We will be looking at harvest within these zones and determining whether or not they're still appropriate or if they need to be broken up into differently. Again, we have the same online tool for reporting your mountain lion harvest and scheduling your check-in. We also have resources on our website that walk through determining the sex and identification of a mountain lion if you're looking to target a male or a female for your harvest. For predators and fur bearers, the only thing that we're doing right now is for bobcats. We continue to monitor the population using age at harvest. We collect teeth from trapped bobcats and have been getting those teeth aged. We will be running a population model similar to what we have done for mountain lions to determine the population of bobcats across the state and within individual game management units. We have also implemented a cause-specific mortality study. This study we've gone out and we've put radio collars on bobcats, and we will use that mortality data to help inform the population model and in determining what our statewide population is for bobcats. We don't have any current research going on for coyotes or any other predator fur bearer species. So that's all I've got for big game. I'm going to pass this over to Larissa, and she will continue with the small game program and the migratory bird information.
Good evening and thank you. I'm Larissa Harding. I'm the small game program manager for the state, and I'll just take you through a couple things. Okay. I'm going to adjust the height here a little bit. So small game, if you've been paying attention, a lot of the changes to small game and migratory birds this last year came in the form of opening up new areas, and particularly national wildlife refuges down south. There were several refuges that expanded either opportunity through expanding areas or adding species or seasons to refuge policy to let hunters come and hunt small game. We expect that there will be more changes in the next year or two as additional national wildlife refuges come online with changes that open up and expand opportunities. So some of the things just to point out, we often get asked about why we don't change bag limits on Mearns quail in particular. And so just to kind of address that here, Mearns quail, if you're a Mearns quail hunter and you're paying attention to small game, and there's a lot of passionate quail hunters out in Arizona, but Mearns quail depend primarily on the summer monsoon rains. And so, as you know, the last summer or two, we've had what we all have been calling non-soons, which means we've had little or no monsoon moisture the past 2 summers. And what that means for Mearns quail is that there's going to be lower reproduction and recruitment into the population. So I'm hearing from lots of hunters, why don't you just reduce the bag limit then on Mearns quail? And if you look back at the history of Mearns quail management and hunting here in Arizona, the Commission has actually changed the bag limit 7 times since the first Mearns quail hunt went off in 1960. And most of that time period, the limit was actually between 10 and 15 birds a day. And so the Commission, as they've changed the limits over time, primarily those changes came as an effect or as a result of social input or social reasons, and they weren't biological. And the thing to remember about quail, and particularly Mearns quail in Arizona, is that if you look back at prior research in Arizona on Mearns quail that was designed to look at hunted populations versus non-hunted populations, What those studies show is that lowering the bag limits does not actually reduce the percentage of the population that gets removed during the hunt. And so that suggests to us and to a lot of quail hunters that quail hunters do a good job in regulating themselves. If you're here in Arizona hunting quail, you know it's not an easy endeavor, and it takes a lot of effort, and often through cactus or boulder country. And so when quail numbers are lower, quail hunters tend to be lower in the field with their dogs. One of the things to remember about small game and drought conditions is that small game respond readily to favorable environmental conditions. Most of our small game species are very closely linked to precipitation on the landscape and the resulting green up or habitat improvement that brings. And so just to point out those two graphs on the side, the top graph looks at total number of birds harvested from Mearns quail in the darker line, the purple there. And the orange or lighter line above it is the hours hunted as reported by hunters through our surveys and through our wing barrels, where you can report effort on envelopes as you submit wing samples. Down below, just to kind of show you how closely those numbers follow precipitation. This is precipitation in Patagonia from a weather station started back in the 1940s, but I've selected the same years, 1978 to 2020. That's as long as we've got Mearns quail harvest data, and so making those comparable. If you look at those lines, the pink line or the darker line there is actually the monsoon moisture. And for me, I just generally characterize that as the sum total of precipitation from June through September. And that's what that pink line is over each of those years. The yellow line or the lighter line above that is actually the annual total precip across the years. So that would include things like snow and other weather events that come through on an annual basis. And if you look at that pink line in the lower chart and the purple line in the top one, you see that they kind of mirror each other. And that just confirms again that those small game are responding to weather conditions and to precipitation. And for Mearns quail, that summer monsoon precipitation in particular. And so, as Amber said, those hunt guidelines that we've established and that you help establish every 5 years, they work, and we manage quail successfully, and we've managed them through drought cycles before. And if you want to do anything for quail, start doing your rain dances. So pray or dance for rain, because that's the thing that will help quail the most here in Arizona. On a positive note, what drought did for us here in Arizona was concentrate Sandhill Cranes in those wetter areas of their wintering grounds. If you have been watching the news or watching our websites or the Watchable Wildlife website that we have with the critter cams, you've seen a copious amount of Sandhill Cranes down on the Whitewater Draw and the Wilcox Playa this year. Sandhill Crane numbers actually exceeded 47,000 birds in our January 2021 count. That is the highest number of birds that we have counted on record here in Arizona. And that seemed to be fairly widespread across the states that belong to what's called the Pacific Flyway. It's most of our western and intermountain and coastal states here west of the Continental Divide. And so those increased numbers of birds have allowed us to increase some of the permits. And you'll see that in this year's hunt recommendations, that several of the hunts that are going off have increased permits by 10 or 5 or 20, I don't think there's 20, but upwards of 10 permits per each of those hunts. There is still a mandatory check station in Unit 29 for this fall, and those hunters who draw out Unit 29 will receive specific information about where to check in birds and how to do that. So just to conclude, if you feel like there's anything else that we should address or specifically look at, we welcome those questions and comments. You can, again, email those comments to azhuntguidelines@azgfd.gov. and we will answer those as we can get through them. As we receive them, we try to be responsive and timely in those responses to you. And with that, I'll just say good night, and we wish you all happy hunting.